In the pitch-black skies over the South Pacific, Japanese pilots believed they owned the night. For centuries, warfare had been governed by the rising and setting of the sun, until American technology shattered this ancient limitation. By mid-1943, a terrifying new predator was stalking Japanese aircraft through the darkness. The radar-equipped Grumman F-6F Hellcat and Vought F-4U Corsair night fighters. What Imperial Japanese Navy commanders had deemed impossible was happening with alarming frequency. Their bombers were being intercepted and destroyed in complete darkness with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. The bewildered Japanese High Command, lacking comparable technology and understanding of radar principles, initially suspected American pilots of having extraordinary night vision or even using some form of witchcraft. In reality, they were witnessing the first large-scale deployment of airborne radar in the Pacific theater, a technological revolution that would forever change the nature of aerial warfare. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. The story of America's radar-guided night fighters begins not with a dramatic aerial duel, but in crowded laboratories and testing facilities across the United States. In the late 1930s, as war clouds gathered over Europe and Asia, American military planners recognized a critical vulnerability in air defense: the inability to detect and intercept enemy aircraft at night or in poor visibility. Radar, radio detection, and ranging technology was in its infancy, with Britain's Chain Home system providing early inspiration. But the real challenge lay in miniaturizing these systems enough to fit them into fighter aircraft. The genesis of airborne radar can be traced to a small group of physicists and engineers at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Radiation Laboratory, established in October 1940 with urgent funding from the National Defense Research Committee. Dr. Luis Alvarez, a brilliant physicist who would later win the Nobel Prize, led a team focused on adapting Britain's cavity magnetron technology, a revolutionary device that enabled the production of high-frequency microwaves necessary for compact radar systems. The pressure was immense, with scientists working 16-hour days in a race against both the Axis powers and the fundamental limitations of 1940s electronics. By December 1941, when Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor thrust America into World War II, the development of airborne radar had progressed from theoretical possibility to practical reality. The first experimental sets, designated AI, Airborne Interception Mark IV, were bulky affairs that barely fit into the largest aircraft. These early systems used frequencies around 200 mmHz, providing limited resolution and range. The real breakthrough came with the shift to microwave frequencies, which allowed for smaller antennas and more precise detection. The Pacific theater presented unique challenges that made radar particularly valuable. Vast oceanic distances meant battles often occurred far from land-based detection systems. The tropical climate brought frequent storms and cloud cover, limiting visibility. And Japanese forces had proven adept at using darkness to conduct bombing raids against American naval forces, particularly during the brutal Guadalcanal campaign of 1942-43. The geography of the Pacific War, thousands of islands scattered across millions of square miles of ocean, created an operational environment unlike any in military history. American forces needed to protect widely dispersed fleet elements and isolated island garrisons from Japanese air attack. Without radar, this would have been impossible, requiring more aircraft and personnel than the United States could possibly deploy. With radar, a single night fighter could patrol an area that would otherwise require multiple aircraft operating in daylight. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of Fast Carrier Task Force 58, was particularly vocal about the need for effective night interception capabilities. "Until we can fight as effectively at midnight as we do at noon," he reportedly told his staff in early 1943, "we are fighting with one arm tied behind our back." His concerns were well-founded. During the early battles around Guadalcanal, Japanese washing machine Charlie aircraft, a nickname given by American forces to Japanese aircraft that conducted night harassment raids, would circle above American positions at night, dropping bombs seemingly at random. The psychological effect was often worse than the physical damage, as exhausted soldiers and sailors were denied sleep night after night. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, recognized the strategic importance of gaining control of the night sky. In a directive issued in January 1943, he ordered the acceleration of night fighter development. "The enemy has exploited our inability to counter his night operations. This advantage must be neutralized with all possible speed. Priority is to be given to the development and deployment of radar-equipped night fighters." The urgency was underscored by the losses sustained during night naval engagements. The Battle of Savo Island in August 1942, fought in darkness, had resulted in one of the worst defeats in U.S. naval history, with 4 Allied heavy cruisers sunk. While this was primarily a surface engagement, it highlighted the Japanese skill in night operations and the American weakness in this domain. Similar advantages in night aerial operations gave Japanese forces a tactical flexibility that American commanders were determined to counter. Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare, the Navy's first flying ace of the war, advocated strongly for the development of night fighter tactics. Having witnessed the vulnerability of American forces to night attacks during the Guadalcanal campaign, O'Hare understood that technological innovation alone would not be sufficient. Pilots would need to develop entirely new techniques for flying and fighting in darkness. In August 1943, O'Hare was given command of the Navy's first dedicated night fighter training program. O'Hare brought a unique perspective to the challenge. Already famous for his daytime exploits, including the remarkable feat of single-handedly engaging 9 Japanese bombers and shooting down 5 on February 20, 1942, an action that earned him the Medal of Honor. He recognized that night fighting would require a completely different approach. "Forget everything you know about dogfighting," he told his first class of night fighter pilots. "At night, it's all about patience, precision, and absolute trust in your instruments and radar operator." The aircraft selected for this revolutionary role were among America's finest: the Grumman F-6F Hellcat and the Vought F-4U Corsair. Both were exceptional daytime fighters, known for their ruggedness, firepower, and performance advantages over their Japanese counterparts. But transforming these aircraft into effective night fighters required significant modifications. Engineers faced the challenge of installing radar systems weighing hundreds of pounds into aircraft already packed with equipment. The solution came in the form of the APS-4 and APS-6 radar sets, which featured a distinctive pod-mounted antenna installed on the right wing of the fighter. These radars could detect bomber-sized aircraft at ranges up to 5 miles, sufficient for interception in total darkness. The physical installation was only the beginning. Aircraft electrical systems had to be modified to provide power to the radar without interfering with other critical systems. Cockpit displays needed to be redesigned to allow pilots to monitor radar information while maintaining spatial awareness in darkness. Even the aircraft's paint scheme was altered, with special black paint applied to reduce visibility and minimize reflections from moonlight. The most significant modification, however, was the addition of a second crew member, the radar operator. In the F-6F-3E and later F-6F-5N Hellcat night fighters, the radar operator sat in a cramped compartment behind the pilot, separated by armor plating and communication equipment. This arrangement required removing some fuel tanks, reducing range, but creating space for both the operator and additional radar equipment. The radar operator's compartment was so confined that only the smallest personnel could qualify for the role, leading to a saying among carrier crews, "If you can fit in a mailbox, you can fly in a night fighter. Training pilots for night operations proved equally challenging. Fighting at night required an entirely different set of skills. Pilots had to learn to trust their instruments over their senses, which could easily become disoriented in darkness. They had to interpret radar returns with minimal training and coordinate closely with radar operators and ground controllers. Perhaps most challenging was the requirement to fly in close formation at night, maintaining visual contact with other aircraft using only small formation lights that were invisible beyond a few hundred yards. The training program established at Naval Air Station Quonset Point, Rhode Island, was unprecedented in its intensity and specialization. Pilots underwent hundreds of hours of instrument training, learning to fly complex patterns and approaches using only their cockpit gauges for reference. They practiced radar intercepts first in simulators, then in actual aircraft against cooperative targets. Night landing qualifications on carriers, already one of the most demanding skills in aviation, required pilots to touch down on a pitching deck they could barely see, guided only by the dim meatball of the optical landing system. Radar operators received equally intensive training. They had to learn to distinguish between genuine aircraft returns and false echoes caused by weather, terrain, or electronic interference. They practiced verbal communication techniques that would allow them to guide their pilots effectively without causing confusion, and they had to master the maintenance and calibration of their complex equipment, often performing repairs in darkness and adverse conditions. The first operational radar-equipped night fighter squadron, VFN-75, was established in May 1943, flying from USS Enterprise. The squadron's early results were modest but promising. On the night of November 26, 1943, a VFN-75 Hellcat scored the squadron's first confirmed kill, shooting down a Japanese Betty bomber near Tarawa Atoll. The Japanese crew never saw their attacker. Lieutenant Richard E. Harmer emerged as one of the first night fighter aces. Flying a radar-equipped F-6F-3N Hellcat with night fighting squadron VFN-101 aboard USS Enterprise, Harmer developed innovative tactics that maximized the advantages of radar while minimizing its limitations. His technique involved climbing to high altitude, then using radar to locate Japanese bombers from above before diving to attack. This approach allowed him to use the natural advantage of altitude while compensating for the radar's limited field of view. Harmer's first night victory, on February 10, 1944, demonstrated the potential of the new technology. Guided by his radar operator, aviation radioman First Class William Pratt, Harmer intercepted a Japanese Betty bomber approaching Task Force 58 off Truk Atoll. In his after-action report, Harmer described the engagement. Radar contact was established at 4.5 miles. We closed to 800 yards before visual contact was made, identifying the target as a Betty bomber. The enemy aircraft showed no awareness of our presence until I opened fire at 200 yards. The bomber exploded immediately, confirming a complete surprise interception. This pattern, radar detection at several miles, visual identification at close range, and firing at point-blank distance, became the standard template for night interceptions in the Pacific. Unlike daytime dogfights, which often involved complex maneuvering and extended engagements, night victories typically resulted from a single devastating firing pass that left the enemy with no opportunity to evade or return fire. Japanese forces, meanwhile, were completely unprepared for this new threat. Japanese naval aviation had not invested significantly in radar technology, focusing instead on exceptional pilot training and aircraft performance. Their night operations relied on skilled pilots with exceptional night vision and careful mission planning rather than technological assistance. When American radar-guided night fighters began appearing in late 1943, the Japanese military had no effective countermeasure. The technological disparity reflected fundamentally different approaches to warfare. Japanese military doctrine emphasized the human element, the skill, courage, and spirit of the individual warrior. American doctrine, while not discounting these qualities, increasingly emphasized technological superiority as a force multiplier. This divergence would prove decisive as the war progressed, with radar representing perhaps the clearest example of America's technological advantage. Intercepted Japanese communications from early 1944 reveal the confusion and concern among Japanese commanders. One captured document from the Japanese Naval Air Force headquarters in Tokyo requested urgent information about the Americans' ability to see in absolute darkness. Another questioned whether American pilots were being given special drugs to enhance their night vision. The concept of miniaturized radar was so foreign to Japanese military thinking that it simply didn't occur to them as an explanation for their mounting losses. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commander of the Japanese Mobile Fleet, ordered a scientific investigation into possible American night fighting technologies. The investigating team, led by Captain Toshikazu Omai, correctly identified radar as the likely explanation, but concluded that Japan lacked both the technical expertise and industrial capacity to develop comparable systems in time to affect the war's outcome. Omai's report, delivered in April 1944, recommended tactical adaptations rather than a technological response, a tacit admission of Japan's inability to compete in this crucial domain. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, often called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of America's radar advantage. During the daylight phase of the battle, American fighters shot down hundreds of Japanese aircraft. But it was the night action that truly shocked Japanese commanders. As Japanese carriers launched a desperate counterattack at dusk on June 20, 1944, American radar operators tracked the incoming strike force with precision. Radar-equipped Hellcats intercepted the Japanese aircraft more than 50 miles from the American fleet. In the ensuing melee, fought in near-total darkness, American pilots claimed more than 30 Japanese aircraft shot down, while losing only a handful of their own. The most dramatic night action occurred when Vice Admiral Meacher ordered a night recovery of American aircraft returning from strikes against the Japanese fleet. This dangerous operation, landing hundreds of aircraft on carrier decks in darkness, was made possible by radar guidance. Japanese observers monitoring American radio traffic were astonished by the precision with which American aircraft were vectored to their carriers despite the absence of visible navigation aids. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commander of the Japanese Mobile Fleet, later wrote in his battle report, "The Americans appear to possess some form of magical vision. Their fighters found our strike force in complete darkness, at a distance that should have made us invisible. We must discover the source of this power, or we cannot hope to challenge their control of the air." The reality, of course, was not magic, but technology. The American fighters were guided by a sophisticated system that included shipboard radar, fighter direction officers who processed the radar information, and the airborne radar systems in the night fighters themselves. This multi-layered approach allowed American carriers to create a protective bubble extending dozens of miles in all directions, day or night. The effectiveness of this system depended on close coordination between multiple specialists. Shipboard radar operators, usually enlisted personnel operating SK or SC surface search radars, would detect incoming aircraft at ranges up to 100 miles. This information would be relayed to the Combat Information Center, CIC, a specialized compartment where fighter direction officers, FDOs, monitored the tactical situation on plotting tables. The FDOs would then direct night fighters to intercept positions, guiding them via radio until the fighter's own radar could acquire the targets. Lieutenant, junior grade, Hamilton McWhorter III, flying with VFN 76 from USS Hornet, described one such night interception. The fighter director called out the bogey's position, 12 miles out, bearing 270. I couldn't see a thing but darkness, but my radar operator, Ensign James, called out, Contact, 2 o'clock, 5 miles. I turned toward the contact and started closing. At about 800 yards, I finally saw him, just a darker shape against the dark sky. I closed to 200 yards and fired a 2-second burst. The Japanese bomber erupted in flames and spiraled into the sea. We never heard a shot fired in return. They never knew we were there until it was too late. The psychological impact on Japanese air crews was profound. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's leading aces, later recalled the growing fear among Japanese naval aviators. We began to believe the Americans could see in the dark. Our night missions, once considered safer than daylight operations, became suicide assignments. The feeling of being hunted by an invisible predator was terrifying, more so than facing an enemy you could see. This technological advantage extended beyond carrier operations. As the island-hopping campaign progressed across the Pacific, land-based radar-equipped night fighters began protecting American airfields and fleet anchorages. Marine Night Fighting Squadron VMF N-532, flying F-4U-2 Corsairs equipped with APS-6 radar, provided night cover for the invasion of Peleliu in September 1944. Their presence prevented Japanese night bombing raids that had been a standard harassment tactic in earlier campaigns. The Marines brought a different approach to night fighting, reflecting their focus on supporting ground operations rather than fleet defense. Major William Mastus, commanding officer of VMF-N, 532, developed tactics specifically for intercepting Japanese aircraft attempting to attack beachheads and forward airfields. His squadron operated from hastily constructed forward bases, often within range of Japanese artillery, maintaining night patrols despite challenging conditions and limited support facilities. The technological gap between American and Japanese forces was most stark in their different approaches to night operations. By late 1944, American carriers routinely operated around the clock, launching and recovering aircraft regardless of light conditions. Night fighter squadrons maintained constant combat air patrols during darkness, while specialized night torpedo bomber squadrons conducted anti-shipping strikes. Japanese forces, by contrast, remained largely constrained by daylight, retreating to safety during darkness or conducting limited operations with their most experienced pilots. This operational disparity had strategic implications. American forces could maintain continuous pressure on Japanese positions, preventing resupply or reinforcement even under cover of darkness. Night precision bombing became increasingly effective, with radar-equipped TBM Avenger torpedo bombers adapting to a nocturnal attack role. By early 1945, Japanese ships could find no sanctuary, facing air attack at any hour and in any weather conditions. The impact on Japanese morale was devastating. Lieutenant Sadamu Komachi, one of the few Japanese night fighter pilots, later recalled, "We began to feel that there was nowhere to hide. Before, the night was our ally. Now, it seemed to belong to the Americans. This created a feeling of vulnerability that was new to us. Even our most experienced pilots became hesitant to fly at night, knowing they could be attacked without warning." The psychological impact extended to Japanese strategic planning. Increasingly, Japanese commanders planned operations with the assumption that they would be detected regardless of conditions. This defensive mindset limited their tactical options and contributed to the increasingly reactive nature of Japanese operations in the latter stages of the war. Japanese attempts to develop countermeasures were hampered by limited resources and technological capacity. A crash program to develop airborne radar, initiated in mid-1944, produced only a handful of experimental sets by war's end. These systems, based on captured American equipment and reverse-engineered components, were crude approximations of their American counterparts, with shorter range and poorer resolution. Some Japanese pilots attempted to adapt tactically to the radar threat. Flying at extremely low altitude could sometimes allow aircraft to hide in the ground clutter of radar returns from the ocean surface. Approaching from the direction of land masses could similarly confuse radar operators. and dispersing into smaller formations reduced the radar cross-section, making detection more difficult. But these tactics came with significant drawbacks, including increased fuel consumption, navigational challenges, and reduced combat effectiveness. By early 1945, as American forces approached the Japanese home islands, the technological disparity had become even more pronounced. New American radar sets, like the APS-4, had shrunk considerably in size while improving in performance. Night fighter tactics had matured, with specialized squadrons developing sophisticated coordination methods with shipboard radar operators. Japanese night defense capabilities, meanwhile, remained rudimentary, with only a handful of radar-equipped aircraft available for homeland defense. The culmination of this night-fighting capability came during the Battle of Okinawa in April–June 1945. Japanese forces launched desperate kamikaze attacks against the American fleet, often timing their approaches for dawn and dusk to minimize detection. Radar-equipped Hellcats and Corsairs, however, maintained a constant protective screen around the fleet. On the night of May 14, 1945, night fighters from USS Enterprise shot down 11 Japanese aircraft in a single engagement without suffering any losses. The success of radar-guided night fighters represented more than just a tactical advantage. It demonstrated the decisive impact of technological superiority in modern warfare. American industry had not only produced better aircraft in greater numbers than their Japanese counterparts, but had fundamentally transformed the nature of aerial combat through electronic systems that extended human capabilities beyond their natural limitations. This pattern would define American military doctrine for generations to come, with successive waves of technological innovation serving as force multipliers for American combat power. The human dimension of this technological battle should not be overlooked. For the American pilots who flew these night missions, the experience was both exhilarating and terrifying. Lieutenant Commander William Killer Kane, who scored 5 night victories while flying with VFN 91, described the unique challenges. Night fighting wasn't just about the technology. The radar gave you a general idea where the enemy was, but you still had to get close enough to confirm visually and make the kill. Flying itself was more difficult. No horizon to reference, no visual cues except your instruments. It took a special kind of focus to function effectively under those conditions. For radar operators, the pressure was equally intense. These enlisted men, often overlooked in accounts of aerial combat, were responsible for directing their pilots toward contacts that neither could see with the naked eye. Coordination between pilot and radar operator had to be seamless, with precise communication and mutual trust. A misinterpreted radar return or confused direction could result in a missed interception or, worse, a collision. Lieutenant Commander Richard Harmer credited his radar operator, aviation radioman First Class Wilfred Denton, with much of his success. Denton could read that radar screen like a book. He knew the difference between a weather return and an aircraft, could estimate the enemy's speed and direction, and could guide me in from any angle. Without him, I'd have been flying blind in every sense of the word. The bond between pilot and radar operator often transcended professional necessity. Lieutenant John Connolly of VFN 101 recalled, "You put your life in each other's hands every night. There's no closer relationship in warfare. We ate together, bunked together, and fought together. I trusted my radar operator, Thomas Schultz, more than anyone else in the world." When he said bogey at 2 o'clock, I turned without hesitation, even though I couldn't see a thing. That kind of trust doesn't come easy. The technological revolution represented by radar-guided night fighters extended beyond the immediate tactical advantage it provided. It fundamentally changed American thinking about warfare, emphasizing the critical importance of technological superiority and information dominance. The ability to fight effectively regardless of environmental conditions, day or night, clear weather or storm, became a cornerstone of American military doctrine that continues to the present day. The impact on military aviation was profound and lasting. The integration of electronic systems into combat aircraft established a trajectory that would lead to the sophisticated multi-sensor platforms of the modern era. The concept of the weapon system, an aircraft defined not merely by its flight performance but by its integrated detection, tracking, and engagement capabilities, emerged directly from the radar-equipped fighters of World War II. The story of radar-guided night fighters also demonstrates the remarkable speed of technological adaptation during wartime. From the first experimental installations to fleet-wide deployment took less than 2 years. This rapid cycle of innovation, testing, and implementation allowed American forces to maintain a critical edge over their adversaries, who lacked both the industrial capacity and the technical expertise to match these developments. The air war over the Pacific was transformed by this invisible advantage. As American forces pushed ever closer to Japan in early 1945, a new and even more advanced generation of night fighters was preparing to enter service. The powerful ground attack variant of the Corsair, the F4U-4N, would have been capable of precisely targeted night bombing raids against Japanese industrial targets. The Ryan FR-1 Fireball, which combined a conventional piston engine with a jet engine, was being developed as a radar-equipped night fighter that would have had overwhelming performance advantages over any Japanese aircraft. For Japanese military leaders, the implications were clear. They faced an adversary that had mastered the darkness, stripping away one of their few remaining advantages. As Admiral Motomi Ugaki noted in his diary in February 1945, "The Americans have conquered the night as thoroughly as they have conquered the day. We are left with no sanctuary, no place to safely prepare our forces for battle. They can see us, but we cannot see them." This, more than any other factor, makes our position increasingly untenable. As 1945 dawned, Japanese admirals and generals gathered in Tokyo to assess their increasingly dire strategic situation. The radar-guided night fighter capability had expanded American operational hours to a full 24-hour cycle, while Japanese forces remained largely constrained to daylight operations. This created a fundamental asymmetry in combat capability that Japanese commanders struggled to address. According to post-war interviews with surviving staff officers, this technological gap was considered one of the most significant factors in Japan's inability to effectively counter American offensive operations in the war's final year. The Japanese Imperial Navy's High Command, meeting in the underground war room beneath Tokyo Bay Naval Headquarters, faced the sobering reality that their traditional naval doctrine had been rendered obsolete. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, opened the January 1945 Strategic Conference with a stark assessment. "The Americans have achieved what we believed impossible. They have eliminated night as a tactical factor. Our plans, which relied on darkness for concealment, must now be entirely reconsidered." When we could no longer use the cover of darkness to reposition our forces or conduct surprise attacks, we lost a critical dimension of warfare, explained Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack in 1941. It was as if the Americans had added a new element to the battlefield that we could not access. The implications extended beyond tactical considerations. Japan's entire strategic approach to the Pacific War had been predicated on the assumption that night operations would provide a critical equalizer against America's numerical superiority. Their naval doctrine, developed in the 1920s and 1930s, emphasized night torpedo attacks by destroyers and cruisers, supported by carrier aircraft operating at dawn and dusk. This doctrine, which had proven effective in early war engagements like the Battle of Savo Island, now lay in ruins. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, architect of the kamikaze strategy and former commander of the 1st Air Fleet, presented a detailed analysis of the night fighting disparity. "Our pilots report being detected at ranges exceeding 30 kilometers, in complete darkness with no possibility of visual detection. American fighters then maneuver into attack position with inexplicable precision. We must assume they possess some form of airborne detection system that functions independently of visibility conditions. The psychological impact on Japanese aircrews was equally significant. Knowing they could be detected and engaged at any time, regardless of weather conditions or darkness, created a persistent sense of vulnerability. Pilot morale suffered as losses mounted. With experienced air crews, Japan's most precious and increasingly irreplaceable resource being lost at unsustainable rates. Lieutenant Tadashi Nakajima, one of Japan's few remaining experienced pilot instructors by early 1945, described the effect on training. We had to completely revise our tactical doctrines. Traditional approaches that relied on surprise or concealment were no longer viable. But we had neither the technology nor the time to develop effective countermeasures. Our student pilots entered combat knowing they faced an enemy who could strike from invisible positions. This psychological dimension cannot be overstated. Japanese pilots had once enjoyed a justifiable confidence in their superior training and aircraft performance. By 1945, this confidence had been replaced by a fatalistic resignation. As one pilot from the 302nd Naval Air Group wrote in his diary, "We are being hunted day and night. The Americans seem to have supernatural powers. They find us in darkness, in clouds, even when we fly low over the waves. There is no escape. We fly now only to die with honor." The impact of radar-guided night fighters extended beyond air operations. Japanese naval movements were increasingly restricted to areas and times where air cover could be provided, a nearly impossible task given American air superiority. Supply convoys to isolated island garrisons, already vulnerable to submarine attack, now faced the additional threat of precision night airstrikes. The result was a steadily tightening blockade that starved Japanese outposts of essential supplies and prevented the movement of reinforcements. The strategic implications were profound. Japan's defensive perimeter, already broken by American advances in the Philippines and Marianas, became increasingly fragmented as isolated garrisons could no longer be effectively supplied or reinforced. Islands that might have been defensible strongpoints were transformed into liability traps for Japanese forces. The inability to move naval forces or supplies under cover of darkness accelerated the collapse of Japan's outer defense perimeter. Major General Yoshijiro Umezu, chief of the Imperial Japanese Army General Staff, acknowledged this reality in a February 1945 assessment. Our strategy relied on maintaining isolated island garrisons as delaying positions, forcing the Americans to engage in costly assaults. This approach is no longer viable when these positions cannot be supplied. We are now facing the prospect of our forward forces being isolated and defeated in detail without achieving their strategic purpose. The Japanese home islands themselves were increasingly vulnerable to night attack. In March 1945, night-fighting F-6F Hellcats began escorting B-29 Super Fortress bombers on night raids against Japanese industrial targets. These fighter escorts neutralized Japan's limited night interception capability, allowing the bombers to operate with near impunity. By May 1945, American carrier groups were conducting round-the-clock operations against the Japanese homeland, with specialized night attack squadrons targeting airfields, port facilities, and transportation infrastructure. American technological dominance in radar was not achieved overnight, nor was it maintained without significant challenges. The early radar systems were notoriously temperamental, requiring constant maintenance by skilled technicians. Salt spray, tropical humidity, and the vibrations of carrier operations all took their toll on delicate electronic components. Maintaining operational readiness rates above 70% was considered a significant achievement for early radar-equipped squadrons. The technical challenges were substantial. The AN/APS-6 radar set, standard equipment on the F-6F-5N Hellcat, by late 1944, contained more than 300 vacuum tubes, each a potential point of failure. The radar's magnetron, the core component that generated microwave energy, was particularly sensitive to shock and vibration, Carrier landings, with their bone-jarring impacts, frequently knocked these systems out of alignment. Maintenance crews worked around the clock to keep the equipment operational, performing delicate calibrations and component replacements on cramped flight decks or in sweltering hangars. Lieutenant Commander William Saunders, engineering officer for VFN 90, described the maintenance challenge. These radars were essentially laboratory equipment being operated in the most hostile environment imaginable: salt spray, tropical heat, constant vibration, and the occasional Japanese bullet. The fact that we kept them working at all was a minor miracle. Our radar technicians became as important to our combat effectiveness as our pilots. The human element was equally challenging. Radar operation was a specialized skill that required both technical knowledge and intuitive understanding. Radar operators had to learn to distinguish between genuine aircraft returns and false echoes from weather, waves, or islands. They needed to estimate range, bearing, and altitude from the primitive displays available, and they had to communicate this information clearly and concisely to pilots who were simultaneously flying the aircraft, monitoring their instruments, and scanning for visual contact. Commander John S. Thatch, the innovative tactician who had developed the Thatch-Weave fighter formation, played a key role in integrating radar technology with practical fighter tactics. The radar was just a tool, he explained in a post-war interview, a powerful tool, but useless without pilots trained to exploit its capabilities and limitations. We had to develop an entirely new approach to aerial combat, one that combined traditional fighter pilot skills with this new technological dimension. Thatch recognized that the most advanced technology would be worthless without appropriate tactics and training. He established specialized training programs that focused not just on the technical operation of radar equipment, but on the coordinated teamwork between pilot, radar operator, and fighter direction officer. His approach emphasized simplicity and standardization, creating procedures that could be reliably executed under the stress of combat conditions. The training program Thatch helped establish at Naval Air Station Charleston produced pilots specifically qualified for night operations. These aviators underwent intensive instrument training, learning to fly with minimal visual references. They practiced radar intercepts under simulated combat conditions, gradually building the unique skill set required for effective night fighting. By mid-1944, these specialized training programs were producing pilots capable of operating in complete darkness with a high degree of confidence. The curriculum was rigorous and unforgiving. Pilots spent hundreds of hours in link trainers, early flight simulators that replicated instrument conditions, before progressing to actual night flights. They practiced formation flying using only small, shielded lights, visible to friendly aircraft but invisible from a distance. They conducted simulated interceptions against cooperative target aircraft, gradually increasing the difficulty until they were executing complex maneuvers in complete darkness. Lieutenant James Johnson, an instructor at the Night Fighter Training School, emphasized the psychological aspects of the training. We had to overcome the natural human fear of flying in darkness. Many excellent daylight pilots couldn't adapt to night operations. Their instincts fought against trusting instruments over their senses. The ones who succeeded developed an almost Zen-like acceptance of flying without visual references, a willingness to believe the instruments even when every instinct screamed otherwise. One of the most successful night fighter units was VFN 101, nicknamed the Night Hecklers. Commissioned in May 1944, the squadron flew radar-equipped F-6F-3N and later F-6F-5N Hellcats from USS Enterprise and USS Independence. Under the command of Lieutenant Commander William J. Vidhelm, the squadron developed tactics specifically suited to the unique challenges of night combat in the Pacific. Rather than the twisting dogfights that characterized daylight engagements, night interceptions were methodical, almost scientific in their execution. Guided by fighter direction officers aboard the carriers, night fighters would climb to altitude and then patrol assigned sectors. When radar detected incoming Japanese aircraft, the fighters would be vectored into favorable attack positions, ideally approaching from below and behind the target. The coordination between shipboard radar, fighter direction officers, and night fighters created a lethal trap for Japanese aircraft. Surface search radars, like the SK-2 with ranges exceeding 100 miles, would provide initial detection. Fighter direction officers in the carrier's Combat Information Center would analyze these contacts, distinguishing between friendly and enemy aircraft based on known flight plans and identification friend or foe IFF signals. They would then vector night fighters to intercept positions, guiding them until the fighter's own radars could acquire the target. Lieutenant Robert Buchanan of VFN 101 described a typical interception. You'd pick up the bogey on radar at about 5 miles. The radar operator would guide you in until you were about half a mile behind. Then, if conditions were right, you might catch a glimpse of exhaust flame or a silhouette against cloud cover. The key was getting close enough for a certain shot without being detected. Too close, and you risked collision in the darkness. Too far, and you might miss. We aim for 200-300 yards, point-blank range for our 650 caliber machine guns. The night fighter squadrons developed a distinctive culture, separate from their daytime counterparts. They operated on a reversed schedule, sleeping during the day and flying at night. Their ready rooms were kept dark with red lighting to preserve night vision. They developed their own jargon and traditions. The pilots of VFN 76 called themselves Batmen, adopting a stylized bat as their unofficial squadron emblem. VFN 90 members referred to themselves as Midnight Monsters and painted their aircraft with grinning demon faces visible only under ultraviolet light. These night fighters operated in an environment that seemed almost supernatural to their Japanese opponents. Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's leading ace with 34 victories, visited VFN 101 in early 1945 and later wrote, "Their world is utterly different from ours. We hunt in the sunlight, they stalk in darkness. We rely on what we can see, they trust invisible electronic signals. Watching them prepare for a mission is like observing a different species. They check equipment we don't have, discuss concepts we don't understand, and then vanish into a night sky where we would be helpless." The technological race continued throughout the war, with both sides seeking advantages. American engineers continually refined their radar systems, reducing size and weight while improving range and resolution. The APS-6 radar, introduced in late 1944, was significantly more reliable than earlier models and could detect fighter-sized aircraft at ranges up to 3 miles. Japanese engineers, meanwhile, struggled to develop comparable systems with their limited electronics industry. American radar development benefited from an industrial and scientific base that Japan could not match. The MIT Radiation Laboratory alone employed over 4,000 scientists and engineers by 1945, working exclusively on radar technology. By contrast, Japan's entire radar development program employed fewer than 500 specialists, divided between Army and Navy research facilities. This disparity in resources and expertise was reflected in the quality and quantity of the resulting equipment. The advanced state of American radar technology was the result of massive investment and prioritization. By war's end, the United States had spent more on radar development than on the Manhattan Project that produced the atomic bomb. This investment yielded not just better equipment, but a comprehensive understanding of radar principles that Japanese scientists were only beginning to grasp. Japan did make attempts to counter the American radar advantage. Their primary approach was not technological, but tactical. Japanese night bombers began flying at extremely low altitudes, using the radar shadow of the ocean surface to mask their approach. They would time attacks to coincide with adverse weather, when rain and clouds might interfere with radar performance. Some aircraft were fitted with primitive radar warning receivers that could detect when they were being scanned by American radar, allowing them to take evasive action. The most sophisticated Japanese countermeasure was the deployment of window, strips of aluminum foil dropped from aircraft to create false radar returns. This technique, developed independently by both Allied and Axis powers, could temporarily confuse radar operators by creating clouds of false targets. However, experienced American radar operators quickly learned to distinguish between the characteristic signals of window and actual aircraft. These countermeasures achieved limited success. In February 1945, during operations around Iwo Jima, low-flying Japanese aircraft managed to penetrate the American radar screen and damage several ships. However, these were exceptions rather than the rule. The overwhelming trend was toward increasing American dominance of the night skies. The technological disparity was compounded by Japan's inability to train replacements for their experienced pilots. The Japanese Naval Air Training Program, once the world's finest, had deteriorated dramatically by 1944 due to fuel shortages and the loss of experienced instructors. New Japanese pilots received less than 120 hours of flight training before entering combat, compared to the 500-plus hours given to American pilots. Night flying training was virtually non-existent in the Japanese program by war's end. Captain Minoru Genda, one of the planners of the Pearl Harbor attack and a respected naval air strategist, later reflected, "Our pilots were expected to compensate with spirit and sacrifice for what they lacked in training and equipment. This was asking the impossible. No amount of courage can overcome such technological disadvantage, especially in night fighting, where human senses are already compromised." The radar war extended to ground operations as well. As American forces established air bases on captured islands, they deployed SCR-270 and SCR-527 early warning radar sets. These ground-based systems could detect approaching aircraft at ranges up to 150 miles, providing ample warning time for fighter interception. Japanese attempts to neutralize these radar installations became a priority, with special attack missions specifically targeting radar sites during the Philippines and Okinawa campaigns. Marine night fighter squadrons played a critical role in defending these forward bases. BMFN 533, stationed on Saipan, maintained constant night patrols that prevented Japanese bombing raids from disrupting B-29 operations. Their effectiveness was demonstrated in April 1945 when they intercepted and destroyed a specialized Japanese reconnaissance aircraft attempting to assess damage from B-29 raids on Tokyo. The aircraft, a modified G-4M Betty bomber equipped with advanced cameras, was shot down by a radar-equipped F-4U Corsair before it could complete its mission. The human cost of this technological battle was substantial on both sides. American night fighter pilots faced dangers beyond those of conventional daylight operations. Spatial disorientation, the tendency for pilots to lose their sense of position relative to the horizon when flying without visual references, claimed numerous lives. Mid-air collisions during formation, flying, or intercept attempts were a constant hazard. And the psychological strain of operating in darkness, often alone and far from the carrier, took a toll that many pilots only acknowledged after the war. Commander William Lefebvre Martin, flight surgeon for Air Group 90, documented the unique stresses experienced by night fighter crews. These men operate in an environment that violates every natural human instinct: the darkness, the isolation, the complete dependence on instruments and radar. It creates psychological pressures unlike anything in daylight operations. We observed higher rates of combat fatigue, sleep disorders, and anxiety among night fighter personnel, despite lower actual combat losses compared to daylight squadrons. The physical demands were equally severe. Night vision requires the body to produce rhodopsin, the chemical that enables the eye to function in low-light conditions. This process takes approximately 30 minutes of darkness to complete. Night fighter pilots had to protect their night vision zealously, wearing red-tinted goggles before flights and avoiding any bright light exposure. Diet was also critical. Vitamin A deficiency could significantly impair night vision, leading to special dietary supplements for night fighter crews. For Japanese air crews, the situation was even more perilous. Flying without the benefit of comparable radar systems, they were essentially blind, while their opponents could see them clearly. Lieutenant Minoru Genda, one of Japan's most brilliant naval aviators, later admitted, "We were fighting with one arm tied behind our backs. Our pilots had courage and skill, but against an enemy who could see in darkness, those qualities were not enough." Japanese night air crews faced a particularly cruel dilemma. Flying low to avoid radar detection increased their vulnerability to anti-aircraft fire and made navigation more difficult. Flying at higher altitudes made them easier targets for radar-guided night fighters. Either way, their chances of completing missions and returning safely diminished with each passing month of the war. By the spring of 1945, American night fighting capabilities had reached their full maturity. Carrier air groups typically included a dedicated night fighter squadron equipped with radar-fitted F-6F-5N Hellcats or F-4U-5N Corsairs. These squadrons operated in concert with night torpedo and bomber squadrons, creating an around-the-clock offensive capability that Japanese forces could not match. The integration of night fighting into carrier operations transformed naval aviation. Traditional carrier operations had been limited to daylight hours, with aircraft secured at night except in emergencies. By 1945, American carriers were conducting continuous flight operations, with specialized night lighting systems allowing for safe launch and recovery regardless of visibility conditions. This operational flexibility gave American commanders options that their Japanese counterparts could not contemplate. The effectiveness of these night operations was demonstrated during the air raids against the Japanese home islands in the summer of 1945. While B-29 super fortresses conducted massive daylight raids against Japanese industrial targets, carrier-based night fighters suppressed Japanese defensive fighters and attacked airfields under cover of darkness. This combination left Japanese air defenses exhausted and ineffective, unable to mount sustained resistance to either daylight or night attacks. The strategic impact was devastating. Japanese war production, already crippled by material shortages and shipping losses, was further compromised by the inability to conduct repairs or move components during night hours. Factories that might have recovered from daylight bombing were prevented from doing so by night harassment raids. The psychological effect on the civilian population was equally significant, with continuous air raid warnings preventing rest and recovery. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, recognized the strategic importance of this capability. In a message to the fleet following operations against Tokyo in February 1945, he specifically commended the night fighters. "The ability of our carrier forces to strike at any hour, in any weather, has denied the enemy any respite from attack. The night fighters who maintain this pressure deserve special recognition for their skill and courage." The development of night fighting capabilities had not been without cost. Beyond the material and training investments, numerous pilots and radar operators had lost their lives developing and refining these techniques. Some of the Navy's finest aviators, including Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare, had perished while pioneering night interception methods. The story of radar-guided night fighters is also one of individual courage and innovation. Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare, already famous as the Navy's first ace of the war, volunteered to develop night fighting tactics despite the known dangers. On the night of November 26, 1943, while flying a radar-equipped Hellcat from USS Enterprise near the Gilbert Islands, O'Hare's aircraft disappeared during a night interception mission. The circumstances of his loss remain somewhat mysterious, with evidence suggesting he may have been caught in crossfire between American gunners and Japanese bombers, or possibly shot down by a Japanese aircraft he was pursuing. O'Hare's death highlighted the dangers faced by these pioneering night fighters, but did not slow the development of night fighting capabilities. Instead, his legacy inspired a new generation of naval aviators who continued to refine the tactics he had helped establish. Chicago's O'Hare International Airport now stands as a permanent memorial to his courage and innovation. The technological advantages represented by radar-guided night fighters had implications that extended far beyond the Pacific War. The integration of electronic systems into combat aircraft pointed toward the future of aerial warfare, where information superiority would become as important as speed or firepower. The radar operator, a new type of combat air crewman who fought with electronic signals rather than guns, foreshadowed the growing importance of technical specialists in modern warfare. The concept of the kill chain, the sequence of detection, identification, tracking, and engagement that defines modern air combat, emerged directly from night fighting experiences in World War II. Today's beyond visual range air combat, where aircraft engage enemies they cannot see with their eyes, is the direct descendant of those night interceptions over the Pacific. The lessons learned from these operations influenced post-war aircraft design and tactical development. The need for dedicated night fighters led directly to aircraft like the F-7F Tiger Cat and F-3D Sky Knight, which were designed from the outset for night and all-weather operations. The concept of the two-man crew, pilot and radar operator, became standard for fighter aircraft designed in the late 1940s and 1950s, culminating in aircraft like the F-4 Phantom II, which maintained this configuration into the jet age. The electronics industry itself was transformed by wartime radar development. Companies like Raytheon, which produced magnetrons for radar systems, emerged from the war with technologies and expertise that would fuel the post-war electronics boom. The miniaturization techniques developed for airborne radar directly influenced early computer development, and the systems engineering approach pioneered in radar programs established methodologies that would be applied to countless technological projects in the decades following the war. Perhaps most significantly, the success of radar-guided night fighters established the principle that technological advantage could overcome traditional limitations in warfare. This lesson was not lost on post-war military planners who invested heavily in electronic systems, leading eventually to the network-centric warfare concepts that dominate modern military thinking. For Japanese military leaders, the experience provided a harsh lesson in the consequences of technological neglect. Japan had entered the war with world-class aircraft and superbly trained pilots, but had failed to appreciate the revolutionary potential of radar and other electronic systems. By the time they recognized the importance of these technologies, it was too late to close the gap. This lesson influenced Japan's post-war industrial development, with electronics becoming a national priority. Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka, Chief of Staff to Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and later commander of the First Air Fleet, reflected on this failure in his post-war memoirs. "We underestimated the importance of scientific warfare. Our focus on the human element, the skill and spirit of our aviators, blinded us to the emerging reality that technology was becoming the decisive factor." The American radar advantage demonstrated that courage alone was no longer sufficient in modern warfare. The Japanese pilots who faced these radar-guided night fighters displayed remarkable courage in continuing to fly missions despite overwhelming disadvantages. Captain Masatake Okumiya, who served as an air staff officer with the combined fleet, later wrote, "Our pilots knew they were outmatched technologically, yet they continued to fly night missions against the American fleet. Their valor deserves recognition, even as their sacrifice proved futile against such technological disparity." This disparity in capability would have become even more pronounced had the war continued into 1946. The United States was preparing to deploy a new generation of radar-equipped night fighters, including the F-8F Bearcat and F-7F Tiger Cat, both of which offered substantial performance improvements over the Hellcat. The Ryan FR-1 Fireball, a mixed-power fighter combining a piston engine with a jet engine, was being readied for night fighting duties. Against these aircraft, Japanese night defenses would have been completely ineffective. As the war approached its conclusion in August 1945, American night fighting capabilities stood ready for the planned invasion of Japan. Operation Olympic, the invasion of Kyushu, scheduled for November 1945, would have included multiple carrier task groups providing round-the-clock air cover. Night fighter squadrons would have suppressed Japanese air defenses during darkness, preventing the massing of forces for counterattacks. Japanese planning documents captured after the war reveal that Imperial General Headquarters had essentially conceded control of the night skies, focusing instead on massed daylight kamikaze attacks as their primary air defense strategy. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, followed by Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, meant that these plans were never tested in combat. The radar-guided night fighters had played their part in bringing the war to a conclusion without the need for an invasion of the Japanese homeland. In the immediate post-war period, the night fighting expertise developed during the Pacific War proved valuable in the occupation of Japan and subsequent operations in Korea. When North Korean forces invaded South Korea in June 1950, carrier-based night fighters were among the first American aircraft to enter combat operations. The F-4U-5N Corsair, a refined version of the wartime night fighters, proved particularly effective in nighttime interdiction missions against North Korean supply lines. The technological lineage established by these pioneering radar aircraft continues to the present day. Modern carrier air wings include E-2 Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft that perform the same function as those first radar-equipped night fighters, albeit with vastly improved capabilities. Today's F/A-18EF Super Hornets and F-35C Lightning IIs carry radar systems that can detect targets at ranges exceeding 100 miles, making night operations routine rather than exceptional. For the Japanese officers who had witnessed the effectiveness of radar-guided night fighters, the lesson was clear. Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who had commanded Japanese naval air forces in the Philippines, observed after the war, the American mastery of night operations represented more than just a tactical advantage. It demonstrated a fundamental difference in our approaches to warfare. We relied on the spirit and skill of our pilots. The Americans combined human qualities with technological superiority. In the end, their approach proved more sustainable. This lesson was not lost on post-war Japan. As the country rebuilt its industrial base, it placed special emphasis on electronics and precision manufacturing, areas where it had fallen behind during the war. Companies like Sony, Panasonic, and later Toyota incorporated the hard lessons of technological disadvantage into their corporate philosophies. Japan's emergence as an electronics powerhouse in the 1970s and 1980s can be seen, in part, as a response to the technological gap revealed by the radar war over the Pacific. The legacy of these radar pioneers extends into modern naval aviation. Today's carrier air wings operate sophisticated aircraft equipped with radar systems that would have seemed like science fiction to the pilots of VFN 101. Yet the basic principle remains the same, using technology to overcome the natural limitations of human perception, allowing effective operations in any environment, day or night. The continuous evolution of radar technology has made night merely another operational condition rather than a limitation. Modern military aircraft operate with equal effectiveness regardless of light conditions, conducting precision strikes and complex maneuvers in total darkness. This capability, now taken for granted, began with those first radar-equipped Hellcats and Corsairs hunting Japanese bombers through the Pacific night. Commander John S. Thatch, reflecting on the development of night fighting capabilities years after the war, offered perhaps the most insightful assessment. The radar-guided night fighter represented more than just a new weapon system. It demonstrated America's unique capacity to combine technological innovation with practical application. In less than 3 years, we went from having essentially no night fighting capability to complete mastery of night operations. That ability to rapidly develop and deploy new technologies may have been our greatest advantage. The story of America's radar-guided night fighters remains one of the most significant yet understudied aspects of World War II aviation history. It represents a perfect example of how technological innovation, combined with tactical adaptation and human courage, can fundamentally alter the character of warfare. The Japanese admirals who were shocked by America's seemingly magical ability to see in the dark were witnessing not just a new weapon, but a new era in military technology, one that continues to shape aerial combat to this day. For the pilots who flew these pioneering missions into the darkness, their contribution extended far beyond the immediate tactical victories they achieved. They demonstrated that the ancient limitations of warfare, the constraints of darkness, weather, and human sensory perception, could be overcome through technological innovation. In doing so, they helped establish a tradition of technological dominance that would become a cornerstone of American military power in the post-war world. As Lieutenant Commander William Killer Kane, one of the most successful night fighter pilots of the Pacific War, observed in his memoirs, "We weren't just fighting the Japanese, we were fighting against the night itself, against the natural limitations that had constrained warfare since ancient times." And in that fight, American technology and ingenuity proved decisive. In the final analysis, the radar-guided night fighters of the Pacific War represent a pivotal moment in military history, the point at which technology definitively overcame the natural constraints that had limited warfare throughout human history. The Japanese admirals who were shocked by this development were witnessing nothing less than a revolution in military affairs, one that would shape the conduct of warfare for generations to come.